Hey, podcast listeners, Professor Anthony Sweat from Church History and Doctrine here. I wanted to give you one note on this episode up front as the executive producer, because we're dealing with extremely sensitive subjects in this episode. If you or someone that you love finds themselves in crisis regarding suicide, the U.S. National Suicide Prevention Lifeline is available at all hours at 1-800-273-TALK. That's 1-800-273-8255. Also, you can visit the church's suicide prevention and ministering website at suicide.churchofjesuschrist.org. Remember, behind numbers and statistics are real individual children of God. Suicide prevention should be a top priority for every one of us. There's no question that anxiety, depression, and suicide are globally on the rise, and at alarming rates at that. The World Health Organization reported that between 2005 and 2015, there was an 18% global increase. You guys, 18% in depression. And in their January 2020 report, they say that 264 million people currently suffer from depression. Tragically, close to 800,000 people every year lose their life to depression-related suicide, with suicide being the second leading cause of death for 15 to 29-year-olds. In the United States, Utah ranks among the highest for both rates of depression and also rates of suicide. Although, as the World Health Organization says, quote, depression results from a complex interaction of social, psychological, and biological factors, end of quote. There's arisen a colloquial and even a popular media narrative that seeks to focus on one factor: the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Justin Dyer, who's a professor of religion in church history and doctrine at BYU with a PhD studying family issues, has done some significant research in this area.
There's a lot of chatter out there in the blogosphere and even the news saying that, well, Utah's really high in suicidality. That must be tied to the church, right? Because there's a lot of Latter-day Saints here in Utah, and the average suicide rate in Utah is higher. Well, it must be because of the church. What we've been finding in our research as well on suicidality in teenagers in Utah is that being LDS is protective. If you're a Latter-day Saint, then your rates of considering suicide are significantly lower than if you're not.
On today's episode, Professor Dyer shares insights and statistics from his research to help better inform the narratives that are often oversimplified and even inaccurate, and can even be harmful when it comes to the youth, the church, LGBTQ members, and suicidality. In part one, we're going to look at why his studies were done and some of the research findings about religiosity, youth, and suicide in general. And in part two of this episode, Professor Dyer will focus specifically on research about LGBTQ youth and suicidality in the church. Let us never forget that in the body of Christ, all are needed, all are wanted, all are important, all are loved. This is Why Religion.
Each year, religion professors at Brigham Young University produce hundreds of publications on subjects related to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. This podcast brings this research into one place to enlighten the everyday seeker of truth.
Seek learning, even by study and also by faith.
Interviewing the author, we discuss why the study was done, why it matters, and why the professor chooses to be both a scholar and a disciple. This is Why Religion. Research to enlighten your mind.
Recently, one of our Why Religion committee members, Professor Ryan Sharp, who's in the Department of Ancient Scripture, sat down with Professor Justin Dyer, who's in the Department of Church History and Doctrine, to talk with him about his research findings about religiosity, suicide, LGBTQ members, and the church. Professor Dyer's research insights are so good, and he does such a great job dealing compassionately with some really difficult subjects. But please keep in mind, though, that the discussion you're about to hear, because it touches on so many complex issues, none of them can adequately be covered in a single podcast episode. For example, this episode does not cover important questions, such as why suicide rates increase in rural areas, What are some of the best practices for preventing youth suicide? Or how to lessen the pain and difficulty that some LGBTQ church members experience? However, what Professor Dyer does so well is he gives great insight into the questions of what does religion do for mental health, and especially for youth? And how does religiosity better inform discussions pertaining to youth suicidality? So, without any further delay, here's Professor Dyer talking with Professor Sharp.
I think it'd be helpful to start with some of the broader work you've done, particularly with religiosity and mental health. And I'm curious, and you sort of alluded to this earlier, but what was it that kind of piqued your interest in studying mental health and specifically mental health of adolescent LDS youth?
The rates of mental health problems is just going off the charts. Since we've been collecting data on suicidality, on mental health, depression, anxiety, we haven't really seen the kinds of things that we're seeing today. It's a major problem all across the nation. And of course, there is some individuals that would claim that, well, religiosity or religion is creating mental health problems. When I was in graduate school and studying families and mental health and those kinds of things, the just general assumption of many of the researchers there was that religion is bad for people, right? It creates guilt, it creates shame, it creates all these problems for people, it creates perfectionism, right? And so the underlying assumption was that religiosity is kind of bad for people in terms of their mental health. And I really didn't have any information that would say one way or the other on that. That was just kind of the assumption along those lines. Having grown up a very religious person and now having kids who are entering the teenage years, something that really interested me was, well, what does religion do for mental health? Is it really as bad as a lot of the assumptions are that are out there? And when I started digging, I found that we have very, very little on Latter-day Saint youth in terms of these things. I mean, we know from a research standpoint next to nothing along these lines. But the general research on religion and mental health, as I came to find out, all generally suggests that religion is very good for a person's mental health. In fact, religious people have lower rates of depression, they have lower rates of anxiety, they have lower rates of suicide and suicidality, thinking about suicide. So all of the research actually points to religion being a really, really good thing for mental health. Now, one of the things that came up was there's a lot of chatter out there in the blogosphere and even the news saying that, well, Utah's really high in suicidality. That must be tied to the church, right? Because there's a lot of Latter-day Saints here in Utah and the average suicide rate in Utah is higher. Well, it must be because of the church. And that was one thing I was really interested in too, is, okay, well, how does the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints factor into the suicide rate of Utah? Does it factor into that suicide rate?
I want to now go back to something that you said earlier about religiosity and mental health, and maybe specifically if we can spend a moment talking about depression. And I want to set it up this way. This is, again, an excerpt from your article. It says, multiple studies have examined the relationship between depression and religion. For example, individuals who struggle with personal religiosity, whether that includes feelings of abandonment by God, loss of faith, trials, or viewing themselves as unworthy, were shown to have poorer mental health outcomes. I wondered if you could spend a few minutes speaking to that and unpacking that for our listeners.
Sure, and that's one. So this gets to one reason why religion is so good for people. Religion is good for people on a lot of levels. One is that they're connected more with the community, right? There's a community of people there that they can connect with, that they can seek out for help. Latter-day Saints youth have bishops that they can go to. They have young women's leaders, right? If for some reason something in the home isn't connecting, they're not connecting with their parents, they have so many more options of individuals that they connect with. And those individuals feel a spiritual stewardship for these youth. And they talk about the youth in young women's presidency meeting or in bishopric meeting. They're talking about the youth and they're trying to figure out how to help them, which youth are having trouble. So you have this community of support. What religion also provides is connection with others, but connection with God. That there is another relationship. There's a relationship with an infinitely loving, infinitely powerful individual that can make them feel secure, no matter what's going on in life. And it also provides meaning. So it makes suffering understandable. And it makes suffering meaningful, and that there is a real opportunity for recompense for anything that we lose in this life, right? We lose a loved one to death. Well, God can make that up, right? We lose these things in our lives, and through, as we talk about the atonement, all those things can be made right through the atonement. So that's why religion gives people so much more and gives them hope in the future. One of the biggest predictors of depression is you have a lack of hope. You don't see hope for the future. Religion provides that.
One of the most fascinating parts for me as I read through this was when you said in the article, interestingly, these are both relational constructs. That is, when teens feel cared about by God and or their peers at church, their depression is lower. This may indicate that for depression, a key protective factor within religion is whether the individual's religious experience facilitates connections with the divine and with others. And I find it fascinating with this connection connected with this concept connected with the scriptures and the Savior's great commandments, love God and love others. And it's almost as if these commandments focus us on those things that matter most and those things that will help strengthen us in our own journey of discipleship.
Absolutely right. That's what Zion is all about. Zion is about creating relationships with others in real, authentic, and deep ways, right? That we're of one heart, right? That you're a part, that you belong. In fact, it's magnificent, the new children and youth program. What are the emblems that everybody's given? What are they called? Emblems of belonging. You belong. You belong here, right? It is a deep-seated need that we have as human beings and children of God to feel like we belong to others. One of the biggest predictors of suicide, is what's called thwarted belongingness. I want to belong and I can't. I'm trying to belong, but I can't belong. That creates a lot of pain for individuals. So that's why the church, creating this belongingness, right? Creating the belongingness with others around you, with other human beings, but then creating a belongingness with God. That's where the real, if you will, deep magic of religion happens, is that I feel a part of others around me. We're one, but then I'm also one with God. And when we disconnect, that's the problem. And that's actually one of the reasons why, at least hypothesized reasons why, the mental health issues are so high today, is that people have disconnected with others and particularly disconnected with religion. You would expect, as people disconnect with religion, increased mental health problems, which is exactly what we're seeing today.
You mentioned a minute ago one of the great concerns and tragedies that has been discussed in your work is that of suicide, and specifically for our purposes, adolescent suicide. In this article, you unpack some unique findings as it relates to suicide and specifically with LDS youth. I wondered if you might just spend some time talking about that.
Well, let's begin with what's happened in suicide throughout the nation. We have increased substantially many times in suicide rates over the last few decades. It's a problem that has touched every state of the United States. Now, one thing that people will note is that Utah is particularly high in suicide rates. And it's important to contextualize that. In other words, to see it in the broader context. So Utah is right in the middle of what we call the suicide belt. Now, the suicide belt is a set of states that are higher in suicidality. That includes states like Nevada, Idaho, Colorado, Wyoming, the Dakotas. This area is really high in suicide. When you look at all of these risk factors taken together, this area, this region of the United States is just higher in suicide. And Utah, in terms of its suicide rate, is about in the middle. We're not the highest in the region. We're not the lowest in the region. We're about average.
Within that so-called suicide belt.
Right. Within that suicide belt, we're about average, if you will, on our suicide rate. So we're not particularly remarkable. Another thing that's important to look at is if you examine Utah by county, and you look at the county rates of suicide. For example, Utah County, which here at BYU, has one of the lowest suicide rates in all of Utah. And in fact, Utah County suicide rate is just slightly higher than the national average, not remarkable in any way here in Utah County. However, Carbon County, which adjuts Utah County, touches Utah County, their suicide rate is three times, actually more than 3 times the suicide rate of Utah County. And again, that has to do with rurality and other factors that I'm sure we're not tapping into there. But our rural counties in Utah are really where there's a high concern, again, because of lower connection and probably lower mental health resources in those areas. So when you look at Utah, you actually see Utah County as we're about national average, whereas you have more rural counties that have far higher rates of suicide. Now, because Utah experienced a dramatic increase in suicides since about around 2008, there's been increased attention in Utah. In fact, Utah, the government said, we want to have the United States Centers for Disease Control come in and do a study and do some analyses of data that we have here in Utah to help give suggestions for what might be going on. Why was there an increase in suicide in Utah? So the Utah state government was very, very interested in this. So they brought in these researchers, and these researchers find what we've been finding in our research as well on suicidality in teenagers in Utah is that being LDS is protective. If you're a Latter-day Saint, then your rates of considering suicide are significantly lower than if you're not. Research that we've done, we have data on 600 Latter-day Saint youth. That's more detailed even than what the CDC had in terms of religiosity, also finds that Latter-day Saints are equal, if not lower, on their suicidality.
If you're interested in more peer-reviewed, high-quality gospel scholarship about Latter-day Saint history, doctrine, or practice, such as the research being discussed in this episode, BYU's Religious Studies Center is a great place to check out. One book I want to point your attention to that was recently published by the Religious Studies Center is called 1820, Dawning of the Restoration by Professor Richard Bennett here in the Department of Church History and Doctrine. This book is really fascinating in that it was written to commemorate the bicentennial of the first vision, but it does something a little bit different. It tries to contextualize what the world was like in 1820 when the first vision burst upon the world. Seeking to capture the essential essence of the age, Professor Bennett explores what he calls, quote, the 4 dominant constellations in the skies of the early 19th century history. Namely, those are these: revolution and reform, romanticism, emancipation and independence, and religious revivalism. In this book, Professor Bennett goes into Napoleon and Simon Bolivar and Beethoven and many, many more luminaries. Dawning of the Restoration is a biographical examination of the year of our Lord, 1820, as it broke upon a weary world that was cautiously seeking new hopes, new dreams, and bold new visions, including Joseph Smith's. Check it out and pick it up at rsc.byu.edu. Well, we've arrived at part 2 of this episode, where normally we talk about how does this research apply. In this case, it's very self-evident and very obvious. So here we're going to take a little bit different course. For part 2, Professor Dyer is going to focus on his research specifically dealing with LGBTQ youth and suicidality in the church. One reason why Professor Dyer has published and spoken out on this particular front is because the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, in conjunction with the Gay and Lesbian Alliance Against Defamation and Parents and Friends of Lesbians and Gays, state that, quote, when individuals and organizations talk about suicide safely and accurately, they can help reduce the likelihood of its occurrence. However, talking about suicide in inaccurate or exaggerated ways can elevate that risk in vulnerable individuals, end of quote. So here's Professor Sharp talking with Professor Dyer to elaborate on some of these potential inaccurate or exaggerated claims.
In your work, one of the more important conversations that you've brought up and addressed is with regard to suicide surrounding LGBTQ teens. And on this topic, you recently wrote, numerous national and regional media outlets, including CNN, ABC, Fox, NBC, and The Atlantic, among others, have inferred some connection between the church and the rate of suicide among LGBTQ teens in Utah. And then you mention that they're correct when they report that many LGBTQ individuals have struggled with the church's policies and teachings. There are research-based reasons, however, this is in your article, to believe that media narratives regarding LGBTQ teen suicide in Utah are sometimes oversimplified, inaccurate, and even potentially harmful. To be clear, it is vital that all act in compassionate and informed ways on this and other issues related to LGBTQ individuals. Behind numbers and statistics are human beings, and there's no doubt that there are deeply troubling trends regarding suicide across the nation. This is a crisis demanding our best efforts. Again, I love the sensitivity to which you address it, and am particularly intrigued by some of the data and the findings from this research. Maybe elaborate on that a little bit, and what is it that you found in your research?
It's very clear. All the research would suggest that LGBTQ individuals are at much higher risk for suicide, and that's a tragedy. Right? No, we need to identify these individuals, these groups who are most at risk, and try to find out what is it that we can do to support and lower their risk of suicide. So the question then comes is, well, because the church defines homosexual sexual relations as a sin, and because the church defines marriage as between a man and a woman, well, does that then increase the suicide risk for LGBTQ individuals? When people say that the suicide rate is higher because LGBTQ Latter-day Saints are dying by suicide at higher rates than others, that's simply just not borne out in any of the research. So if anything from the research, you'd have to conclude that the church is actually dampening suicide rates here in Utah. And in order to look at that, what we can look at is whether LGBTQ members of the church are at higher risk for suicide than LGBTQ individuals who are not members of the church, who are members of other faiths. Now, the data on that is very, very scant. There's hardly actually any data out there. Again, we have collected some data on that, and we've looked at LGBTQ individuals who are part of different faiths and part of no faith. And what we find is no difference. There's no difference in terms of suicidality, considering suicide, for individuals who are Latter-day Saint versus no faith versus other faith. It trends in the direction of Latter-day Saints being lower, Latter-day Saints LGBTQ individuals being lower than others. The highest average rate is among atheist agnostics. And again, that's not surprising given other research in the area. But it's not statistically different. And so we don't see anything in our research that would suggest that Latter-day Saint LGBTQ individuals are at higher risk for suicide than any others. Now, like you say, there are definitely struggles that individuals can have within the church. I mean, that's unquestioned as well, that there are unique kinds of challenges that they experience as Latter-day Saints, and we have to engage where they're at. Right? We have to engage with their struggles, with their trials, and try and understand that and be empathetic to that and help them to achieve that connection with community and with God. The church has a strong emphasis on family, as it rightly should. I teach family. I love family. I mean, I've spent my whole life dedicated to the research and teaching of family life. But something important within this discussion is to recognize that we don't worship the family. That's not the thing that we worship. We worship God. The more that we can help anybody, no matter what their family circumstance is, connect with God, that's really where it's at. And our family life, whatever that looks like, should simply be a manifestation of that worship of God. No matter what a person's circumstance, the restored gospel of Jesus Christ provides the knowledge, the ordinances, the authority to help individuals connect with God in the most meaningful way possible. So we need to help individuals, no matter what their circumstances, be able to do that. These groups have put out what should and should not be done in terms of attributing suicide to one thing or another. And all of them say that we should not simplify it. We shouldn't simplify it down to one cause. The CDC said, as they did their research in Utah, that it's a multiplicity of factors. So one of the things that these national groups have said is that you shouldn't say that, for example, a suicide was caused by bullying. Because what that does is it puts in the minds of other individuals who are bullied that, oh, this is in my future. This is a potential for me. If I'm bullied, then therefore, this is what's going to happen to me. So when you simplify suicide down to just one thing and say that this is why the suicide happened, then other people who are experiencing those same kinds of things, right? Sometimes we reduce it down to depression. The vast majority of people with depression don't die by suicide. Right? There's other factors that are involved in that. Yes, the suicide rate is higher amongst LGBTQ individuals, but the vast majority of LGBTQ individuals will not die by suicide. In fact, there's one gay man who works in this area who was talking to me about it, and he does research on suicide. And he was saying we've got to stop framing LGBTQ individuals in terms of their weakness or their frailties, right? They can be strong, right? They are strong. They have so many attributes to them that speak of resilience, right? And so when we just only focus on the weaknesses or the frailties or the risk factors, we get this notion that, well, if the person is in a particular category, the LGBTQ, or they have depression or they have anxiety, and say that those are the risk factors, and that's what it is, then we can run into some problems in creating these self-fulfilling prophecies. It's important for us not to create these false, very simplistic narratives that, oh, if you have depression, oh, if you're non-heterosexual, oh, if you're this or that or the other, then you're going to be driven towards that. That's unfortunately what a lot of individuals have said about Utah, is that, well, it's for this reason why there's such an increased rate, which is why we made the comment about what Ellen had to say, for example, about that, or others have claimed. Documentary that came out recently claimed the same kind of a thing, that it's because of the church why that's happening. That's just far too simple and may actually do more harm. Putting narratives out there that are disconnecting individuals from what might be protective, that's even more problematic.
So that we don't disconnect people from some places, such as their local congregations and leaders, that can reach out and help them, I mentioned at the beginning of this podcast the church's Suicide Prevention and Ministering website that has some great resources. From that site, here's a brief clip from Elder Dale G. Renlund of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles, speaking about what we need to do as a church and as a people.
So what we need to do as a church is to reach out in love and caring for those who have suicidal thoughts, who have attempted suicide, who feel marginalized in any way. We need to reach out with love and understanding, and you do that in concert with healthcare professionals and with ecclesiastical leaders, with friends and family support.
On the Why Religion webpage, we've placed links to the church's Suicide Prevention and Ministering website and also the Utah Suicide Prevention Coalition. And if you're interested in reading Professor Dyer's publications, we've put links to a few of his articles at rsc.byu.edu/whyreligion. Professor Dyer really is a brilliant researcher and a wonderful human being. Speaking of which, for part 3 of Why Religion, we like to get to know the human being a little bit better. In particular, this brilliant researcher. So for this last part of Why Religion, Ryan Sharp sits down with Justin Dyer and talks with him about his personal journey that led him into academia, into studying issues related to the family, and what brought him to BYU to be a religious educator.
Our listeners may be interested in knowing a bit more about your academic training, so I'd love it if you would just walk us through your story a little bit. Where did you study? What did you get your degrees in? Why did you choose that? Maybe walk us through that.
Sure. So I started out as an undergraduate here at Brigham University and just really enjoyed my time here. When I was here, I got doing some research on families and particularly incarcerated fathers. And that was just such a compelling area for me. I started along those lines and doing that research on those families, and then I decided I wanted to continue doing research, and I went to the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, and there I continued to study incarcerated fathers. I was there for 5 years, got my master's and PhD in human development and family studies. After that, I went off to Auburn University, and I was a researcher there for a year as a postdoctoral fellow. And after that, then I came here to BYU and started in the School of Family Life.
And so what was it that piqued your interest in that kind of a unique topic?
So when I was a missionary in Brazil, I saw that a lot of families were in distress on a variety of levels. And when I came back from Brazil, I decided I wanted to do something with families and understand more about family dynamics and how you help families in various ways. Doing research was such a joy for me because you learn things that nobody knows. And there are so many areas that are needed in terms of research that for us to understand better so that we can really dive in and help families with the kinds of problems that they face. And we're in a new age now, and families are facing all kinds of problems and that are really new in so many ways.
And so how long have you been at BYU?
So I've been at BYU now for 9 years, about 9.5 years. I was 5 years in the School of Family Life, and then after that I came over to religious education. It was right then when the requirements for religious education changed, and every student at BYU would have to take this course called The Eternal Family. And it was an exciting prospect for me to be able to be part of forming up that course and teaching that course here at BYU, and doing research also over here in religious education, focused more on Latter-day Saint families. And so I came over here about 4.5 years ago to start teaching that class and do some research over here.
Elder Maxwell several years ago coined the phrase disciple scholar. Maybe just walk us through your own personal faith journey. What are some of the experiences that you've had that have deepened your faith and rooted you in the restored gospel of Jesus Christ? And maybe in what ways does your scholarship enhance your faith?
So I got into scholarship as I mentioned earlier. When I was serving as a missionary, I thought, boy, what can I do to help people? Right? What can I do to help families? And so research then became an outlet for that. Research became an outlet for trying to determine how I can help other individuals as Christ would, right? We need information in order to reach out and help individuals. And so that's really where it began. It's interesting, through my graduate school days, where most of my professors would not have agreed, to put it mildly, with the church's positions on the family, and where nothing in my studies, if you will, would have been supportive of church positions and doctrine and theology, particularly about the family. I learned something during that time. What I learned was that as your secular knowledge grows, you cannot let your spiritual knowledge lag. You have got to deepen on that. You have to have those in tandem. If a person goes out and gains a lot of secular knowledge, but feels like their testimony or their basic gospel knowledge is fine where it is, they're going to find that their gospel knowledge isn't sufficient to handle the kind of wonderful growth that they've experienced. Secular knowledge is fantastic. There's so many wonderful things out there to learn that we have to learn. I think even Doctrine and Covenants commands us to learn things about all sorts of aspects about the world. However, with that expansion, we also have to expand in spiritual knowledge at the exact same time. We can't let one outpace the other. And that's why, as I suppose, experiment upon the samples that I collect and learn about them, I also have to be experimenting upon the Word. I also have to be following the commandments in order to know, is this true? Is this right? Is this in fact the Church of Jesus Christ? And it's those experiments on that word that have brought me to the understanding that yes, this is the Church of Jesus Christ. That yes, the doctrines, the teachings of the Church about the next life are reality. The Church's teachings on the family are central to the Creator's design for the eternal happiness of His children.
Thank you for listening to Why Religion. This podcast is a production of religious education at Brigham Young University in Provo, Utah. My name is Anthony Sweat. I'm the executive producer. The Why Religion podcast team also includes from Brigham Young University Professors Brad Wilcox, Casey Griffiths, and Ryan Sharp. Recording and mixing were done by BYU students Mitchell Bashford and Connor Miller. Say hi, Mitchell and Connor.
Hey guys.
Hi.
Original music and scoring for Why Religion podcast was created by the fabulous BYU student musicians Grant Cagle,
Sam Clausen,
Colette Jones,
and
Alistair Scheuermann.
if you enjoy what you've heard, please like and subscribe to Why Religion on wherever you get your podcasts and leave us a rating. It really helps. And join us next time as we continue to bring the everyday Latter-day Saint fascinating gospel studies done by Brigham Young University religion professors to enlighten your mind and strengthen your faith.